Okay, let's go ahead and begin tonight's class. Go to page 73 of the prayer book. And as usual, we'll recite this praise to Shakyamuni Buddha 3 times. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. You can turn the page and we'll go to page 75 and begin with that second full verse and go to the middle of 76. Homage to the Supreme Buddha, homage to the Dharma refuge, homage to the great Sangha, to all three ever devout homage, to all worthy of respect, bowing with bodies as many as all realms atoms in all aspects, with supreme faith I pay homage. Do not commit any non-virtuous actions, perform only perfect virtuous actions, subdue your mind thoroughly. This is the teaching of the Buddha. A star, a visual aberration, a flame of a lamp, an illusion, a drop of dew or a bubble, a dream, a flash of lightning, a cloud. See conditioned things as such. Through these merits, may sentient beings attain the rank of all seeing, subdue the foe of faults, and be delivered from samsara's ocean, perturbed by the waves of aging, sickness, and death. Then go forward to either 97 or 98, wherever the short mandala offering prayer is in your prayer book. And we'll just do that single verse in English with the offering mantra that's on page 98, the Idam Guru, followed by the Refuge and Bodhicitta prayer, once in English, twice in Tibetan. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon, I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandala Kam Niryatayami. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyab suchi daki chunyan gi pesanam gi drola penshir sangye drupar shok. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyab suchi Daki chunyan gi peso nam gi Drola Penshir Sangye Drupar Shog. All right, let's do a short meditation before we begin. As usual, we'll spend a few minutes focusing on the breath, allow ourselves to calm the mind a bit, develop some attention, concentration. And then on the basis of that, we'll set our motivation for tonight. So again, if you have a technique that you already use with the breath, you're welcome to continue to use that for these few minutes of silent meditation. If not, just tune into the sensation at the tip of the nose and make that your meditation object, trying to stay present with it as best as you can. And in any meditation on the breath, we want to be vigilant, check in occasionally to see the quality of our meditation. And if we see that the mind has wandered, gotten distracted in whatever way, then we correct that, letting go of our distractions and returning to the breath. So we'll begin that meditation by ringing the chime, and then we'll do this for a few minutes. So now let's set our motivation for being here tonight for this class. We can begin by recalling one subject we touched on last week in introducing this topic, this text. which is the idea that the Buddha essentially taught two ways of sentient beings being benefited by his advice, by his wisdom. The first is the attainment of high status, which refers to the fact that we can use a portion of what the Buddha taught to help us to gain a good rebirth, to continue to have opportune conditions just like we currently possess. And this is one level of motivation, certainly, for these teachings. But these teachings, because we're looking at the middle way, at the teachings on emptiness that are the key to resolving our situation once and for all, the more important goal is what we call definite goodness. High status is goodness, but it's not definite, it's not certain, it's not something we can rely upon. Might get a good rebirth, but could certainly plummet from that rebirth into one of the lower realms. Whereas definite goodness is a state that we can attain where it's unchanging, it's reliable. We will always have the attainment of the fruits of the path that leads to definite goodness. Definite goodness has two aspects to it. Liberation, which is our own individual freedom from our state of suffering, the first noble truth, the dukkha that we are engaged in, that we have been experiencing since beginningless time, by removing the causes of that within our own mental continuum, the second noble truth. And the Buddha said there is the possibility of that cessation, of the attainment of nirvana, the third noble truth, by cultivating the path, all that the Buddha laid out for us to engage in order to accomplish that goal, the path being the fourth noble truth. And this is dependent upon practicing the wisdom of emptiness. We cannot achieve our own liberation if we don't cultivate that wisdom. Therefore, this level of motivation that is determined to at least attain our own liberation is ideal for engaging in these teachings. It's at least the first level. We have to have that wish to be free from the causes of suffering and to attain nirvana, peace, in order to make the best out of these teachings, make the most out of them. But there is the second goal of definite goodness, which is enlightenment, the state we can attain when we not only remove everything that is keeping us bound in samsara, but even the subtlest imprints from the ignorance that we've had since beginningless time. These imprints that act as the obscuration that keeps us from becoming a Buddha, that keeps us from having the omniscient mind. We want to attain that state because we see that others also want this lasting peace and happiness, are also continuing to experience their unenlightened existence. So we generate that altruistic intention that includes the welfare of all sentient beings. It thinks that we're here in order to accomplish the definite goodness of complete enlightenment, where we will not only attain our own liberation, but we will be able to, through attaining Buddhahood, help all others to actualize their greatest potential as well. And here too, the wisdom of emptiness is absolutely required to accomplish that goal. So because this is the main topic of this course, we want to make sure that our motivation is at that level, wanting to accumulate the wisdom that will help you to actualize the realization of emptiness in your own mind. And by virtue of that, attain not only liberation, but complete enlightenment. A state in which you will be the perfect guide, skillfully helping all sentient beings to develop their own potential as well. So hold that motivation of bodhicitta, the aspiration to become enlightened for the welfare of all, so that everything we do tonight becomes a cause for that result. Okay, so at the last class we did distribute the text. Let me send that around in case there's anyone who still needs a copy of the text. And then there was also a reading list. I only have a couple of copies of the reading list. I'm not sure. I think this was also sent out to people, perhaps. I'm not sure if it did or was or not. We can make more copies at the end of class. If you didn't get a copy of the reading list, maybe come up afterwards and we'll make sure that we make some copies of that. But the text, there should be plenty of copies of the text, I would think. Yeah, I think because a lot of you were here last week. So, and those of you who are online, hopefully you've received those by signing up for this course or getting the information for this course. So in last week's class, we did introduce the subject and the text as well as the author. Nagarjuna is the author of the text that we're studying. Went through a little bit of his biography, the middle way or the Madhyamaka view that he set out, that again is showing us this middle way between these two extremes. You know, the two extremes, all the schools of Buddhist thinking, there are 4 different major tenet systems that were kind of discerned by looking back on everything the Buddha taught over his 45 years. Every one of them teaches some form of a middle way, where there is a distinct point between 2 extremes, an extreme of existence and an extreme of non-existence. And of course, in the middle ways that we're studying here, the extremes are the extreme that we're holding to right now in our thinking, which is the reification of everything, ourselves included, as existing truly, existing inherently, existing from their own side, all these terms that are used to describe this fictitious way that we think everything exists. That's the extreme we've been in since beginningless time. We're learning the middle way view, but the tendency sometimes is to go to the other extreme of some form of annihilation, thinking that we're negating the mere existence of things. The Buddha never said things don't exist at all or that things don't function. Rather, there's a lack of a way of existing that we are adhering to over here, but yet things still do have some form of existence, albeit very, very slight. This is what we're going to get into a little bit tonight by introducing the topic of the 12 links of dependent origination. We'll even talk a bit more about dependent arising or dependent origination. And then, of course, the text name that we are working with is Mula Madhyamaka Karika Prajna Nama. If you add on those additional words that are sometimes not in the title, Mula again means fundamental. Madhyamaka again is this middle way. Karika is referring to the verses, and as we talked about last week, these are very concise verses that set out the meaning of what Nagarjuna wanted to expound upon in terms of what the Buddha taught in the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. So sometimes this is translated in a maybe not quite correct way as treatise. It's essentially verses, or sometimes it's called the fundamental verses on the middle way. And then if you include the Prajnanama, that means called wisdom. So sometimes it's shortened to fundamental wisdom. And that's how I'll be referring to it throughout this course. So we talked about the way that His Holiness introduces this subject, and I don't want to go through all of that again. If you have a chance to read, this is on the book list, The Middle Way, which are the teachings that His Holiness gave on these 3 chapters in Toronto when the Kala Chakra was held there in 2004. Might be worthwhile reading that and going through the way that he introduces it, which again, I don't know that I did justice to last week, but he sets everything in the context of the 4 Noble Truths, a little bit of how we meditated on it today in terms of understanding that we have to use that as the format, the structure for how we are actually approaching our own practice of these teachings. And of course, he went on then to talk about how the 2 truths are the root understanding, the basis, if you will, upon which all of this. All right, so again, and I'm not really giving out any kind of homework with this, but certainly you're welcome to read the books that are on the book list and kind of go through at least it's chapter 26 and become familiar with the verses before we go through them. Certainly you can use this as a bit of a meditation tool. This is said to be one of the main meditations it's done for those on the Hinayana path, particularly the solitary realizers. This is what their expertise is in the 12 links of dependent arising and kind of becoming very adept at understanding how these are correlated to each other. We haven't looked at all of them yet, but even these first 3, we see how there is this causal process that is starting from any moment of ignorance, when together with usually other delusions, we give rise to an action. And that gets imprinted on our consciousness. Even having that awareness during your day can be revolutionary, right? So meditating on it to be able to be more familiar with how that's happening, how is that playing out in your own life? I think it's really useful as a a schema for getting how many of these we're imprinting on our consciousness, so many times. Let's do a few prayers to conclude then. The dedication verses that we won't do the one that we've been doing on Sunday on 246. Instead, let's go to 235 and recite the first two prayers on that page. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then the prayers for our precious teachers. If you go to where the paperclip and the inserted paper is on page 245, we'll do that prayer for His Holiness. Then on page 244, the one on the bottom for Lama Zopa. As we recite these, we can think about all the teachers that we and others have a karmic connection with, whether they're from this tradition or any spiritual tradition. May these spiritual guides have good health and long lives through our efforts here tonight. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Then finally dedicate for those beings that you're holding in your heart right now, whoever that might be, whether it be people or parts of the world where there are great obstacles to well-being right now, those who are experiencing illness that we know, those who have died or are dying at this time that we know. Whoever it is that's experiencing suffering, think of them, send this positive energy out to them. Think that it becomes the cause for removing their suffering immediately, and that it also becomes the cause for helping them to have all the perfect conditions in their life to meet and practice a path that leads to their ultimate happiness. And may all beings gain ultimate happiness through all that we've done here tonight. Okay, thank you all very much. See you next Wednesday. Thank you all who are online. Okay. 23 that are the main point of him emphasizing all these various things around selflessness. This is on pages 3, 4, and 5 of Ocean of Reasoning. And then he finally does come around through chapters 24 and 25 to rebut any refutations that might come from elsewhere. And then he finally, in this chapter that we're going to be studying now, chapter 26, the headline is called The Presentation of the Fact that whether one remains engaged in cyclic existence or withdraws from it depends on whether one understands that selflessness, whether one actually has that wisdom. That is the fundamental wisdom that Tsongkhapa is teaching. So this is the crux of this, is that we're looking at the process by which sentient beings go through the round of existence, going from life to life. These are, of course, called the 12 links of dependent origination. I don't know how many of you studied these in your Dharma studies. We'll try to go through them with enough detail so that if you haven't studied them, you become familiar with them. It's a rather complex teaching in some ways, but it's also, the more you study it, the more simple it seems and very elegant in terms of how it's set out and the way it's put together. So this, again, is called the 12 links of dependent origination. His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself, not in this book, but I've heard him in other books mention that we could call this the slogan of Buddhism. That this is what the Buddha actually, would be, how we would advertise it. Come here for your teachings on dependent origination, because everything is dependently originated. Everything arises in dependence upon other factors. The Sanskrit for this is pratitya samutpada, and essentially it's usually translated as dependent origination, dependent arising. There's probably other translations out there. Usually when it's spoken of in terms of the middle way school that we're studying, which once more is the Prasangika Madhyamika school. So it is a branch of the middle way that is most elaborately set out by Chandrakirti, though Buddha Palita, as we talked about last week, is the founder of this particular branch of Madhyamika. Nagarjuna having been the founder of the entire school of the Madhyamika, the middle way. But essentially this Prasangika Madhyamika, the consequence middle way school, sets out that there are three main ways that things arise in dependence upon other factors. I'm going to go through this first because we're only going to be really looking at one of them, but by virtue of that, we're looking at kind of all of them in a sense. Because when it comes down to it, everything, if we understand the deepest way, which would be the third one, we can come back to the first one and understand how it too is pointing to the same reality. Because dependent origination or dependent arising is leaning towards showing the conventional way that things exist. But by virtue of that, it shows also emptiness because it shows how they lack anything more than that. So the very first level of dependent origination is dependence upon causes and conditions. And this is what we're mostly looking at in regard to the 12 links, are the causes and conditions that lead one to continue to take rebirth in cyclic existence. So causes and conditions are operative with regard to all of what we call functioning things or impermanent phenomena, any conditioned things. There are permanent phenomena that do exist. Emptiness is one, for example, because it's unchanging. The emptiness of this book is unchanging, although the book itself is changing. The emptiness remains static because it is a negation. It is a negation of inherent existence with regard to the book. But everything else, books, and tablecloths and chairs and people and bodies, whatever, everything, minds even, are all everything else in the world that is produced from causes and conditions is changing moment by moment. So those are all impermanent phenomena, and they do depend upon their causes and conditions to come into existence. So our minds, for example, have the prior moment of mind as a substantial cause, but there are many other conditions that bring about various awarenesses. We're going to get into some of these in the 12 links, even how we are able to have contact with objects and develop some knowledge of them and so on. All of this is happening in the basis of causes and conditions that give rise to moments of consciousness. This body is obviously arising from causes and conditions. All the various things that the food we eat, the exercise we give this body, all the processes that are going on, everything is happening to sustain this body. It came from its original cause, which were the substantial causes of the 2 cells from our parents. But essentially, everything is arising on the basis of various factors. This is true of, again, all caused phenomena, that they have that level of dependence. So this is the main one that we're going to be looking at in terms of these teachings. But implicit within it, as I said, is the understanding of even the subtlemost one. The second level of dependent arising is dependence upon parts. So any phenomenon that at all, whether permanent or impermanent, has parts. Whether we talk about spatial parts, the things that are involved in a book, for example, the covers, the individual pages, the spine, of course, all the printing on the pages, and the person who composed it, all the various things, feed into it. But you can, that's the causal part of it. But when you start talking about the parts, you can get into each of these having various components within it. So again, most phenomena, if they are lacking a part, we can't really establish the phenomenon, but yet not some phenomena, I could rip a few pages out of this book and you'd still call it a book, right? But nonetheless, we see that for it to be complete, for it to be the whole, it has to have all of its parts. The parts and the whole are in an interdependent relation. By depending upon the parts, one can establish the whole. So we say there is a body here because the parts of a body are here. We say that there is a mind because the parts of the mind are here. There are many parts to the mind. There are temporal parts, again, different moments of mind. We can divide mind into the 6 consciousnesses. We can divide mind into the various mental factors that are operating. So there's always parts to everything. And even when we talk about emptiness, you might say, well, what are the parts of emptiness? Again, you have temporal parts. You have the emptiness of this book at this moment, at the next moment, and so on. So there's always parts, whether you get into temporal or, again, spatial, directional, whatever the words might be for referring to kind of things that have a third dimension. So nonetheless, this is getting at and hinting towards the third level of dependent origination, which is when we start to see these parts you know, the cover and the front cover, the back cover, the spine, the pages, and so on, all the words on the pages, all of these various parts, when we see them as a basis for the designation of book, then we come to understand that this in my hand is simply the basis for designation, while book is a label that we put on this. There is no real book, because book is a designation that we establish on the basis of a proper set of things coming together that can be designated as such. There's no real book in my hand, because we cannot find, if we do a deeper analysis, that book to exist in any of these parts. The basis of designation helps us to establish things, but it is not inherently the book. So as I said, it's this third level where we really do get to the deepest understanding of emptiness, because it shows that there cannot be anything more than nominal existence. Therefore, the book is empty of anything that's more substantial than that, which would be objective existence, which would be inherent existence, intrinsic existence, existence from its own side, existence by way of its own characteristics. All these ways that we can describe how we are falsely attributing that to books, to people, to minds, to everything that we relate to. So this third level of dependent arising is where we understand that those parts and the basis of designation are lacking any real existence from their own side as what they're being designated as. They exist by mere designation. There is the mere book that is posited on this basis that we find to be suitable for book. But there's no real book in my hand at all. Bookness does not exist from the side of these parts. Bookness exists from the side of the imputing consciousness that decides that this is a book. I mean, for example, there are these little things that I used to find them in San Francisco a lot more in my books, these little creatures that go crawling and they're like book gnats or book whatever. I don't know what they're called. They're not bookworms. Don't say bookworm. Beetles or something. I mean, they're really, really small though. Yeah. But anyway, you know, they don't have that experience of this as a book, right? They have no idea this is a book. For them, it has a whole different appearance. It's like a feast, you know, a field of all kinds of wonderful things that they can go and enjoy and eat and whatever. So this third level does really get to the heart of what Prasangika Madhyamika describes as this view of emptiness. That when we say things lack inherent existence, we have to go to that extreme, all the way right to this very narrow edge of saying that things have anything more than nominal existence. Anything that is greater than nominal existence is refuted. When we say emptiness, we mean that it is lacking anything that is more substantial than in nominal existence. And nominal existence isn't substantial at all. It's really extremely slight. As Lama Zopa Rinpoche says, it's almost as if things don't exist. You know, we're going to go that far. I'll share this with you. I've shared it before in some teachings. And the teaching assistant at the master's program, Jampa Gendan, he said that Lama Yeshe once taught that for Westerners, because we are adhering to things to exist so concretely, that it might be good to aim for this extreme of things not existing at all and then just dial it back a little, you know, because it's really that slight. You know, things don't have much to their existence at all, other than, again, that they're merely designated, merely imputed by an agreement, a conventional agreement. This is why, again, we call that the conventional nature of things. Everything that we establish as existing conventionally is established by virtue of our agreement that we're going to call things a particular name. We're going to give them that identity. We're going to conceive of them in that way. They have that particular function. And of course, then that's how we have agreement in our world about how things are. About most things. Again, we have lots of disputes in the world about things nonetheless. But this is what allows us to actually communicate and be a part of the world. We never are going to deny that there's some level of worldly existence. Again, the Buddha never did that. He just said, we think worldly existence is so much more concrete than it is, so much more substantial than it is. This is the fundamental ignorance that we're trying to annihilate through this wisdom of emptiness. And dependent arising is said to be the king of reasonings, because it helps us to find that fine line between these two extremes, to dial away from the hard, concrete existence that we're adhering to, thinking that everything is self-established, because we see that things actually exist dependently. They cannot have this independent, stand on their own type of existence when they depend upon all these factors, especially being designated by mind. but it keeps you from falling to the extreme of annihilation because you're still establishing things as existing, right? They're dependent arising. They do arise. They do come into existence. So in this way, it is said to be the king of reasonings because it helps us to find that very narrow path between these two extremes. So there are many other reasonings we can use, and it's very valuable to use all the other reasonings that the Buddha taught, and some of them are in this text for sure. We're going to see them in chapter 18, even when we look at the very first verse of chapter 18. One of the reasonings is taught in terms of whether you can find the self to exist inherently as its basis, the aggregates, and so on. There are other ways of approaching emptiness, but dependent arising is very powerful. And Lama Tsongkhapa himself wrote a text praising dependent arising because he saw it as really the jewel of the Buddhist teachings, because it gives us a way to firmly establish that middle way. So this is the idea behind dependent arising, is that while we do see that there are these three factors involved, in the end, they all do point to a lack of inherent existence through the eyes of the Prasangika Madhyamika school. Because if we look at even dependence upon causes and conditions, that dependence rules out any independent existence. Things cannot stand on their own if they are created by causes and conditions. Those causes and conditions are central for anything arising. And when we even look at the process by which things arise, we see that it's very slippery. You cannot find anything to exist in any inherent way. One of the reasonings that's used, it's called production from the four extremes, that Master Chandrakirti looks at in his text. And it actually does come up, I believe, a number of times in, at least once, but I think more than that, in Ocean of Reasoning. I can't remember, maybe Gil remembers or Bob. This production from the four extremes, where you look at the idea of a seed and a sprout. You know, we have this process that we do see happening in nature, right? Where we take a seed, and they even have, I remember seeing these even when I was a kid, they'd have these nature films where they'd have the seed up against glass and the dirt, so you could see the process of the sprout coming up from the seed and what have you. Well, we see that this is merely a matter of designation, right? When are you designating it to end, the seed to end and the sprout to begin? You know, it's purely a subjective thing that we're putting on this. By the process of all that change happening, we're only giving names to various times in that, and maybe even botanists have more names for all the various things that are involved, from seed to sprout to whatever's next, and then to sapling, and then to whatever, blah, blah, blah. So we see that this is, you know, things that are arising from causes and conditions are also speaking to the fact that there's no inherent existence residing there, because it's a process of change, a process of impermanence, a process of things arising from various factors. So His Holiness, again, tackles this chapter 26 because it does show one of the most central ways that we can talk about dependence upon causes and conditions, which is how we ourselves continue to go from life to life to take rebirth through these 12 factors that are all involved in this process, that are all causal links in terms of the arising of our state of suffering, samsara. So as with the Four Noble Truths, which I talked about last week, remember, we had the Four Noble Truths that we can talk about in terms of two pairs. The first two that speak to samsara, that speak to the cycle of existence and how we are caught up in that, through the truth of dukkha, or suffering as it's frequently translated, and the truth of the origin of suffering. Then we have the last two truths, which speak to the cessation or the end of suffering, which can be accomplished by virtue of the path. Those two speak to the enlightened state. So we have the kind of the afflicted state, which is related to samsara, and the more enlightened or liberated state, which is related to nirvana, or Buddhahood, in the case of those who are practicing the Mahayana. We're going to see a similar thing here in terms of how the 12 links are set out, and they're frequently studied in this way and meditated upon in this way. And there's even the wonderful tool, which of course we have posted right outside our Gompa, is the Wheel of Life, which incorporates the 12 links in the outer rim. I don't know if I'll go into the whole teaching on that graphic or anything, but this is posted outside all the monasteries because it reminds one of where one is at in this cycle of existence, continuing to create the causes for our own suffering and how we want to be liberated from that. So when we see the links in the forward order from the first link all the way through to the 12th, we understand, therefore, just as with the first two noble truths, how we are circling in samsara, how we are creating our own suffering. And so Nagarjuna, through the first 9 verses of this chapter, it's a very short chapter, I think it's one of the shortest chapters in the text. The first 9 verses in this chapter Tsongkhapa, or Nagarjuna, goes through the process in the forward order. How from our ignorance arises compositional actions, from those actions arises consciousness, and so on. Kind of takes it all the way through in that process in the forward order, which is essentially showing how through the force of our own ignorance, which is the root of the whole problem, as we've already been talking about, we continue to go from life to life. Then in the last 3 verses of this chapter, 10, 11, and 12 of chapter 26, he looks at it in the reverse order, which is essentially the same as the last 2 noble truths, the cessation of our suffering and what will lead to cessation, which is essentially showing that when we end various factors, the whole process is untangled, the whole process falls apart, that we can remove all the causes that are leading to our suffering in this, by addressing the 12 links in that reverse order. So we're going to be looking at those in the enlightened class in the reverse order in the last part of this discussion. All the 12 links, though, if we look at them from that point of view, because it's only when we go back in the reverse order that we see that if we cease one, well, then we cease what comes before it and cease what comes before that, and so on. But in this forward process, certainly we can see very clearly that all 12 of these links are factors that are involved in our own afflicted existence. Thereby, they must be one of the factors. Either they are a true suffering or they are a true cause of our suffering, because that's what's in the afflicted class. Those are the first 2 noble truths. So if you want to know, I mean, I can go through this again at the end, but the first link, the 8th link, and the 9th link are afflictions. Remember that afflictions are one of the most important causes of our suffering that we are trying to address. The other cause of our suffering is karma, or action. And that's the 2nd and the 10th link. Then we have the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 11th, and 12th. Those are all the resultant suffering that we have. Maybe I'll go through that again at the end. But the idea is that all of these 12 links fit into these 3 categories. The suffering that is the first noble truth, or the causes of suffering, which are our own karma, our actions, and our delusions. So it's, again, another little structure that we'll look at as we go through this. And then Lama Tsongkhapa's text in the Ocean of Reasoning, when he puts his commentary together, the outline for that actually works with the first 7 in a separate outline heading, which are called the causes and effects that propel one into life. And then the last 5 of the 12 are under the outline of the resultant causes and effects. I'm not so sure, this isn't a traditional way of explaining these, but it's how Lama Tsongkhapa went about doing that. So we'll look at that a little bit later. So we are going to start with the very first verse of chapter 26. So if you have that in front of you, let's go ahead and read that verse, which introduces actually the first 2 links, both ignorance and the actions that arise from that ignorance. So let's read that. It's on page 7 of your text. Obscured by ignorance and for the sake of rebirth, we create the 3 kinds of action. It is these actions constructing existence that propel us through transmigration. So again, I think most of you have some kind of outline of the 12 links already that you've worked with, but I could have probably provided a little list of them at least to work with, but most of you know that the very first link, yeah, Gil? Anything that's bracketed was probably added by the translators. So there isn't a word that correlates with that in the Nagarjuna's text, but it was deemed necessary to be added by the translators. In this case, the translators, pretty much, I think it was pretty much Thupten Jinpa, who's His Holiness's translator, who added that. So there aren't that many places where we got bracketed information. There are some translators that put in a lot of bracketed information, believe it or not, where you're almost feeling like you're reading a commentary rather than the actual verse. But in this case, there's only this one word that's added. So it is these actions constructing, and that was really all that the text said, and existence was deemed necessary to put in there to show that that's what it's constructing. It's constructing our cyclic existence, our existence in samsara. Okay, so let's look at this verse and kind of pick this apart a little bit. So the very first line says, obscured by ignorance. This is what we've been talking about so far, this ignorance that projects onto all phenomena, though the main one being, again, the self that we're going to look at in chapter 18, and pick this all apart to understand the emptiness of the self. But this ignorance projects self-existence or true existence, inherent existence, independent existence. Again, we can use many different, they call them hypothetical synonyms because it isn't a real synonym. There is no real inherent existence or self-existence. It never has existed. We've believed in something that's fictitious since beginningless time. So this ignorance projects that self-existence onto phenomena, onto ourselves, onto everything that we experience. And that gives rise to various other delusions. The most notable being the other two of the three poisons. Ignorance is the third poison. The other two are attachment and either aversion, anger, that type of energy, which are correlated to the two different types of experiences we tend to gravitate towards or away from, which would be the experiences of pleasure, the pleasurable feelings that we're going to see feeling coming in as the seventh link. Feeling is a seventh link. We're going to have that coming in and being shown as a major factor. But when we have pleasurable feelings, we often develop the mind of attachment because we are adhering to an inherently existent self, thinking that this object that we are experiencing, which we also think inherently exists, will satisfy that inherently existent self. So we grasp at it, we cling to it, and we don't want to be separated from it. At the same time, or in relation to the unpleasant experiences that we have, which are those times when we have a feeling of pain or suffering arising in our continuum on the basis of some object we've experienced, we are at the same time projecting all of the same sort of things in terms of inherent existence of those qualities, inherent existence of that object, inherent existence of the self, and we are relating to that object with the opposing mind of aversion, anger, wanting to push it out of our existence or experience, to get away from that and to not have to experience it any longer. So these kind of are the two poles through which our ignorance is manifesting in terms of how we think, see, and act in the world. Because we do things on the basis of these two poles of being quite attached to the pleasant experiences, being averse to the unpleasant ones. But the driving force underneath all of this is the ignorance that thinks that all of this is real, that adheres to all of that in this fictitious way, thinking that things have that independent existence. So under the control of the afflictions then, the fundamental root of ignorance combined with generally attachment and aversion and the variety of other delusions that we just studied when we were doing the Minds and Mental Factors courses here, we create the actions that then propel us into a further existence. So the first two links are describing the fundamental way in which we create the causes for rebirth in samsara, which is through the force of our ignorance, we engage in an action. And usually the intermediary of other afflictions involved, like I said, there's the attachment or the aversion that are often involved in many of the negative actions that we engage in, or positive actions, because everything's included in this, as we see. It said the three kinds of action. I'll explain those in a moment. All the actions that we engage in, as long as they're rooted in ignorance, are simply going to keep the wheel going, are simply going to keep rebirth and samsara occurring. So it says there, obscured by ignorance and for the sake of rebirth, which is a little strong. We can say definitely in line with causing rebirth. For the result of rebirth, we create the three kinds of action. What are the three kinds of action? If we go to Tsongkhapa's commentary, let me read a little bit from there, from Ocean of Reasoning. We see that Tsongkhapa says, in introducing this, he says, here one might ask, what is that dependent origination to which Nagarjuna refers to in the earlier lines? Whatever is dependently arisen, that is explained to be emptiness. We'll see this when we get to chapter 24. And what is that dependent origination, by seeing which he says in these lines that the reality of the Four Noble Truths is seen? So again, this is the whole introduction to this chapter. And we see that the very first verse, Tsongkhapa comments saying, ignorance is not just the absence of insight into the way things really are, nor just something different from it. Instead, it is the very opposite of that knowledge and is completely heterogeneous with it. In other words, it's completely outside, opposing the wisdom that we need to realize, the wisdom that realizes that things lack this inherent existence. So he says it is the grasping of the person and phenomena as truly existent by objectifying them, and of course, reifying them. In virtue of the real facts being obscured by ignorance, the person performs, that is, gives rise to, these three actions we call meritorious actions, which are essentially the virtuous actions that lead to good conditions within the desire realm, which would be rebirth as a human, a demigod, or a god, among the 6 types of rebirth within the desire realm. Non-meritorious actions, which are what give rebirth to the 3 lower rebirths in the desire realm, which would be rebirth as a hell realm, being as a preta or hungry ghost, as an animal, and of course all of the unfavorable experiences that we have in any of the realms of existence. Those are all caused through non-meritorious actions. And then here he defines it or uses the word unshakable. Sometimes we use unmoving or unwavering, I think is what Thupten Jinpa uses. This is a 3rd type of action that is essentially virtuous. It is meritorious in its nature, but it is going outside of the desire realm in that it is developing these deep concentrations that are part of the form realm concentrations, the 1st through the 4th concentration realms of the form realm are practiced as a way of deepening one's meditative absorption so that you have a very stable mind in which to develop realizations. But then there are the 4 formless absorptions which follow from those that get very, very subtle and are not as useful for realizations. But nonetheless, those 2 types of practices, the 4 concentrations of the form realm, the 4 absorptions of the formless realm, they lead to rebirth in those actual realms. The Buddha said that there are essentially 3 realms of existence. What we call the desire realm, which as I explained a few minutes ago, has these 6 different types of existence. That's where we are. We're in the human realm of the desire realm. Then we have the form realm, which is a realm where there still is form as we have form in this world, but the form is much more subtle. It's not quite as coarse, and it even lacks a few of the things that we have in this life because existence in the form realm isn't quite as coarse as this in terms of needing to imbibe food and things like that. Then you have the formless realm. The formless realm is, just as it says, formless. You don't have any physical form in that realm. According to the tantric teachings, there's a very subtle level of wind that abides with the mind at all times. So you will have that subtle wind with the mind, but the mind essentially goes into one of those existences in the formless realm. And then I don't know where it abides. I mean, you can't talk about it spatially because it's not something that has any form to it. But then eventually that karma is ceased and one comes out of that. All of these realms are temporary. The form realm, the formless realm, the desire realm, you don't abide in them until forever. You abide in them as long as the karma is for you to be in those realms. And then you move on. So essentially what we're talking about again then with these 3 types of actions are the first 2, meritorious and non-meritorious, are what give rise to the varied experiences in the desire realm. The more pleasant, enjoyable experiences within the desire realm, especially rebirth as a human or a god or a demigod, because that's what we're talking about mostly here, is what the karmas that will be propelling you into your next existence. So in that way, we can talk about meritorious karma being what will give rise to a rebirth as a human, a god, or a demigod. In terms of non-meritorious, we are talking about the karma that will give rise to a rebirth as a hell being, a preta, or an animal. In terms of the unwavering or non-moving, and by the way, it's called that because at whatever level you develop the karma of a particular form realm or formless realm, for example, at the 2nd concentration level of the 4 concentrations of the form realm, it's unwavering in that it causes you to take rebirth in the 2nd concentration realm of the form realm. So the karma of meditating in this way in a human life will generate the karma to be reborn in that particular realm in whatever level you have accumulated the karma for. So the 3rd one that we're talking about then in terms of this unwavering gives rebirth into an existence in the form realm or the formless realm. Was that explained clearly enough? It's a little hard to sometimes get our heads around this. But we're not so, I mean, most of us, we haven't developed this 3rd one, perhaps, this unwavering karma or unmoving karma. You have to engage in really deep concentration to accomplish that. And these existences are much more peaceful. We can say they're happier existences in some regard, but the mind isn't really super delighted in those realms, it's actually very equanimous. It doesn't have a whole lot of things going on one way or another. And you sort of check out of whatever existence you came from after having developed those. And then eventually once more, the karma ceases. And then according to the same process, you would take rebirth in another realm. So these are the three that are talked about primarily according to Tsongkhapa, is whether these are meritorious, non-meritorious, or unwavering, unshakable, again, as it's called in this translation. We could also, though, include in this, because there's another way of dividing our actions into three. Anyone recall how, when we talk about non-virtues, how are the three categories of the 10 non-virtues? Actions done through body, speech, and mind. So the three doors, or the three avenues through which we engage in any creation of karma. And of course, when we have committed a kind of, oh, we've got one of the mics needs to be muted. So when we have a full action, a complete action that is done with all the factors entailed through our body, meaning a physical action that we've done, primarily the acts of killing, stealing, or sexual misconduct, through our speech, which are the actions of having lied, divided people with our speech, spoken harshly or spoken meaninglessly. Those give rise to a rebirth when they are complete. And then finally, those of mind, which are covetousness, harmful intent, and wrong view. When we've engaged in those fully, we planted a seed that will give rise to a rebirth. So those are the ones that are done non-virtuously, the non-meritorious karma. We can also have meritorious by avoiding those non-virtues and engaging in more positive actions. You can also, of course, through your body, speech, and mind, engage in the meditations that will bring about your rebirth in the form and formless realms. I mean, the body and the speech aren't quite as involved in that, but certainly the mind is. So through the avenues of these three doors, we also can be said to create the karma by which we take rebirth. So whether we talk about the three actions in terms of what they actually delineate, in terms of where we would potentially take rebirth, or whether we talk about the three avenues through which we engage in action, we can use either one as a way of talking about the three actions here, the three kinds of action. Then it says, it is these actions constructing our existence, constructing your future rebirths, that propel us once more from transmigration to transmigration. They keep us going from life to life. Now, I want to pause at this point just to talk about these two links, because they are set together in this one verse, kind of for a nice reason, because they show how often we create those first two links. Through the force of our ignorance, we engage in action. Sometimes it's even called compositional action. We compose actions through our body, speech, and mind that are of a variety of forms. And then in the third link, when it comes, we'll get to that shortly, those get imprinted on our consciousness. That's kind of the setup for any individual set of the 12 links. So every time through the force of our ignorance, we engage in any type of action, whether it be just a thought we have in our mind that is complete, or whether it be an actual, something we do with our bodies or our speech, we are planting this seed that could give rise to rebirth at some point in the future. So we have countless of these kind of first few links that are sitting there in our mental continuum, waiting for the other factors to help bring them into their full fruition. This action that is being created in link number 2 is the same action that we're going to see when we get to link number 10, which is when that action, through the force of all these factors that we're going to look at, has been made fully potent. It is then capable of projecting us into the next rebirth, and it will project us into our next rebirth. So every time we've had any of these actions, we've started a new round of the 12 links. And many of those rounds of the 12 links are just simply waiting there in that not yet actualized state. They're in this potential state, but they haven't been made to that full potency. They're waiting for all the other factors to come into play. So this is, a really heinous thing that's going on with our minds. By virtue of our ignorance, we are doing this, not quite round the clock, but zillions of times in a lifetime for sure. And we've done this zillions of times in prior lifetimes. We have all of these that we've created that are simply waiting for the causes and conditions to propel us into another life. Well, they stay there unless we purify them, especially, those that are negative. They all stay there until one of them comes forward and takes us into the next life. It's kind of outrageous when you think about it, because only one can ripen at the end of any particular life, right? Because you're going to be thrown into another existence. You don't get thrown into 5 existences at a single time and exhaust 5 karmas. Instead, you're going to have one karma that comes forward. So I don't know. I find it a little bit mind bending to think about how many times we've created these first few links. All this that kind of is residing in our consciousness, these subtle imprints that are waiting for all the causes and conditions to come forward for them to move us into our next existence. So let me go back to my notes and see if there were a few things. I'm sure there's probably a couple of things that I wanted to share in regard to this first and second link. Just emphasizing again that all of these actions that we're talking about in this category are accumulated through the force of having this ignorance that doesn't understand the nature of reality. This is the root link. And essentially we can say Chandrakirti in his text, Supplement to the Middle Way, which was again composed as a way of elaborating upon Nagarjuna's text, not a real strict commentary on it, but kind of taking that as a starting point and elaborating upon what Nagarjuna taught. He says that we can say this root of cyclic existence, this ignorance, is what's called the view of the transitory collection. I'm going to introduce that term because it's an important one to understand. It's what we are refuting in chapter 18 by looking at the self of persons that we are adhering to so much. The view of the transitory collection, it's called a transitory collection that is being observed because it's fundamentally the basis of these aggregates, the mental and physical aggregates that we impute a self and then think that this self exists inherently. So there's a transitory nature to this collection of stuff that's involved in imputing a self. But this view of the transitory collection observes a self that is simply designated, simply imputed to this collection of stuff. There's no real self here at all, and it thinks that that self is real. That's the view of that transitory collection, or that self that is imputed on the transitory collection as being real, as being a real I, capital I, a real mine in terms of the possessor of the various things that the I possesses. It is the view of the transitory collection that is really the heart of all of our problems, as I pointed out earlier. We can say we have ignorance about all phenomena, but if we were to primarily address the ignorance that's adhering to this strong sense of I, this view of the transitory collection that we are talking about, this would be what would unlock the whole process. If we were able to remove that ignorance, the whole set of the 12 links would essentially fall apart because there would be no compositional actions created that would bring about rebirth because we aren't working from a wrong, erroneous conception that would bring about those types of actions. You see the point of this? Kind of, again, we talk about that later when we get into the reversal process. But as we're going through these, I also want to point out how, we can work at various links, obviously, to at least diminish some of this. This is the hardest one perhaps to get at, though, is this first one of ignorance, because this is, something we've had since beginningless time. But that's, again, the purpose of our study here, is to really be able to develop that wisdom over time. The second link, there are some things to think about in regard to. Certainly, we want to try to avoid the actions that will lead to unfavorable states. Why? Because those are greater suffering for ourselves. Why would we want to suffer more? But moreover, we want to continue to develop that wisdom that is going to be essential in removing the first link. If we end up as an animal for several rebirths, and as an animal, we can't create a whole lot of virtuous karma. So we're probably going to be stuck in some sort of round of existences that may, spiral downward. It might be a long time before we get a human existence again. So already we can see too, even though again, these teachings aren't primarily pointing out how to get a good rebirth, that is implicit also in the second link, that we have to be attentive to what kinds of actions we're actually creating, what we're imprinting on our minds, because that will dictate to a strong degree what happens at death in terms of what projects us into our next existence. We're going to see that when we get to the 8th and 9th links of craving and grasping, and how if we have virtuous karmas that we can bring forward at that time, we will have good existences like this one that will at least gain, from the virtuous actions that we've done in the past. So these first 2 links are setting the stage for everything else that follows. The third link is in the next verse, and let's just read actually the first two lines, A and B of verse 2. With volition as its condition, consciousness enters transmigration. So this is the idea again that volition here is sometimes a word that's used for action, for an intended action, with an intended action as kind of the condition for the next link. Because we've committed that action, we then have that imprint that is being placed on the consciousness. They often talk about this consciousness link being divided into two parts. There is what begins as what we call the causal consciousness, which is when we commit that action. Say I engage in an act of lying, and as soon as that lie is complete, which is once more when I have said something that I know to be untruthful to someone who understands me, and they hear it, and it's been received as a lie, whether or not they believe it. They often say that it's not necessarily that they believe it. I have lied. I've committed an act of lying, and say I leave that on my continuum. I don't purify it. Well, then that causal consciousness is from the moment that action ends, when that seed or imprint is planted on my consciousness, and it continues, of course, until it is ripened by the various factors we're going to look at. Then it becomes the second part of consciousness, which is called the effect consciousness, which is when that is fully ripened, and it will then give rise to the next rebirth. It's talking about the consciousness having this imprinted on it at two different points in time, essentially, of course, everything that falls in between. But primarily, first, when it's planted on the consciousness, which is when it doesn't have great potency at all, till the time when it actually is ready to give forth its effect. So when it has that effect potency there and is getting ready to give rise to the 10th link, which is becoming, that is the fully developed karmic seed, then we have the everything in place for the next existence to come into play. So, of course, His Holiness in his discussion of this gets into a whole realm of territory talking about, well, how are these karmic seeds carried from life to life? What's the basis for these seeds? And in the Prasangika Madhyamaka point of view, we can certainly say that in a temporal way, we can say it is consciousness, and in particular, the subtle consciousness. Your grosser levels of consciousness don't go from life to life, because if we look at, again, an animal existence, an animal's mind in terms of the grosser awareness is much different than a human's mind, right? Doesn't have all of the thought processes that we have involved in our mental consciousness, maybe has heightened smell consciousness than what we possess. Even ear consciousness is different than what we possess, right? Because you can blow a dog whistle and humans don't hear it, and so on. So there are different ways that a manifestation of a consciousness in a particular form happen in terms of the gross level. But what is the thread that runs through every being's consciousness is the subtlemost consciousness. Of course, in the tantric teachings, this is called the clear light mind. But that level of consciousness, there is a continuity from life to life. It's unbroken. It continues even into Buddhahood. And it goes back without any beginning. And it is sort of this pure, clear awareness that is going through all of these lifetimes. By the virtue of that mental energy of giving rise moment to moment of the subtlemost consciousness, all of this is carried forward. We could say that on a temporal basis. But of course, in the Prasangika Madhyamaka, when Chandrakirti expounds upon this, he talks about how in Prasangika, because we are going down to the level of showing that things have mere existence, we can say that it is also carried on the basis of the mere I. Because we always have some feeling of an I on the basis of the continual consciousness. You have always been together with some concept of I. The I who you are now, as Phyllis or Gary or whoever in the room, you have a particular identity that goes along with that. But the general sense of an I that is imputed on the basis of whatever aggregates you have is a constant throughout time. It is something that is a way of relating to the experience that is going on in the mind. So you have a mere I that is simply designated on the basis of this combination of stuff, these aggregates that change, that are appropriated from life to life. And this, we could say, is the mechanism by which things are carried forward, is that as long as we have a mere I, then we have a basis for which these karmic seeds get carried forward. You might read His Holiness's commentary to see a bit more about how he presents that out there. But this is the way that the words he uses in the text through Thupten Jinpa's translation, is that the temporary basis of the imprints is the immediate consciousness contemporaneous with the karmic act. So it's your consciousness that is there when you're engaging in that act of lying. And we could say, again, it has a grosser level, but it is also held within the subtler level that is always there with any level of consciousness. Whether I'm asleep, whether I'm awake, what have you, that subtlemost mind is going through all of those moments. But then there's a more enduring basis, His Holiness says, the I, or the person, that is constructed on the basis of the continuity of the person's consciousness. In other words, the mere I. And even His Holiness says that this mere I is only real in concept, in term. That's the basis for the imprints, which are also only real in concept, in term. You end up, as he says, with a very elegant solution. You don't need to posit any sort of stable basis other than the stability of this continual I that we think that we are. I don't know, it's a very subtle point. I'm not sure I'm conveying it to the degree that you need to discern this, but I'm not sure I discern it completely either, frankly, but nonetheless, this is Prasanga gets down to this level where there's nothing required to be a repository for these karmic seeds. Because that, by virtue of that type of thought, you're thinking that there's something that is inherent about those seeds, something that is self-established about those seeds or imprints. That's why all the other schools, and he does go into this a little bit in the text, do posit something. In the mind-only school, for example, they say that there is this mind basis of all. The Alaja Vinaya, I think it's, let me find the exact term in the Sanskrit. Do you remember it, Bob? Alaya Vijnana. Anyway, this is sometimes translated as the mind basis of all, or the foundational consciousness. They posit a whole another consciousness, in addition to the 6 that we normally talk about, as a receptacle, a carrier of all of these imprints. Again, not necessary in Prasangika, because everything is coming down to being merely designated, merely imputed. There's no real basis for those seeds, that is inherently those seeds or imprints. There is no necessity of a place where they are residing, where they are carried forward, a receptacle from life to life. It is just by the virtue of all of what's happening, the thought process that we are engaging in, the mere imputation of all of these various things. So anyway, this is what His Holiness gets into a little bit, and there's an even more sophisticated explanation of how this is happening, where he gets into this term of disintegratedness, disintegration, what have you. I'm not going to go into that because I think it's way beyond what we want to cover in this text, but know that if you want to read that, it's on pages 35 and 36 of the Middle Way, His Holiness is teaching. But once more, you have these 2 moments that we can talk about. The causal consciousness goes together in a sense with these first 2 that we already talked about. By the virtue of ignorance, we commit those actions, what I was just talking about in relation to the first 2, they get imprinted on our consciousness. And they will reside there until the second moment of consciousness arises, which is when they become what we call the resultant or the effect consciousness, when the effects from the imprint-laden consciousness ripen in the new birth. And essentially this is then, I may have mistakenly said this in terms of the way I presented it, it's the first moment of consciousness in the rebirth that one was propelled into by that karma. It's the consciousness that is the effect of all of what has preceded it in terms of the causal moments of that seed having been initially imprinted on the mind, eventually giving rise to the new existence, the new consciousness of a new life, again, which isn't really new in terms of the thread of awareness that goes through it all, but it is a new consciousness nonetheless. It's a consciousness when Gil was first born into this life. That was the effect consciousness upon conception that resulted from the causal consciousness when he created a meritorious action that led him to have a human rebirth. And we all had the same thing happen. By virtue of our virtuous, meritorious actions in the past, we created the causal consciousness. It was together with our ignorance, but it was still a virtuous action, the second link. It was imprinted on our mind, and that causal consciousness over time, at the end of this life, or in the end of the previous life, it ripened into creating the effect consciousness, which is the first moment of the existence that you now have, which was delineated as conception. And we're going to talk about that when we get to birth. His Holiness goes into a whole discussion of the scientific complications that we have nowadays in terms of when does conception really occur, if you have in vitro fertilization and so on, various things, what have you. But nonetheless, when there is sort of a sustainable life in the womb, we can say certainly there has to be some sort of conception that has taken place. When it happens in the process would be a bit debatable, but maybe I'll stop here for questions. It's 8 o'clock, and so we've got about 15 minutes. And before I continue going blah, 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 because I've been doing a lot of blah, 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 let me see if there are any questions on these first 3 links. Yes, Amy.
So when you're talking about like a seed or just the beginning of, before the karma can even ripen, which is this little seed, and then a person goes through a purification, am I making sense? Does that seed like dissolve, go away?
So if the person goes through purifying that negative action, if it's a negative action that's purified, you're talking about, or even at the point where it gives rise to the next rebirth, like we were just talking about, what happens to that seed, that potency or imprint? Well, we would say for most of them, once they've given rise to their result, then they are exhausted. If we have purified them completely, then they're exhausted in a sense. They're curtailed from ever bringing forth that result. But a lot of times purification doesn't completely get rid of that seed. That seed might ripen in terms of a different type of experience. But in terms of what we're talking about here, if you have this potency to create a new rebirth, which is talking about one aspect of the results from karma. Those of you who've studied karma, again, know that there are 4 different results of karma. The one we're talking about is the first one, which is the fruitional or the ripened result, which is the rebirth in another existence. So in terms of this type of karma that we're discussing in the second link, it is a karma that can give rise to another rebirth. So it is the specific types of karma that will bring forth the ripened result. And really, we're just talking about that result. You have many other results that fill in each existence in terms of what you experience and so on. But in terms of actually propelling you, projecting you into another rebirth, then that's the type of karma we're talking about. So if you purify very thoroughly, in a sense, I mean, it's not that you can completely wipe it off of your mind. I mean, you've got the imprint from that on your mind still, but it's been made impotent by virtue of that strong purification. It won't ever develop into the effect consciousness.
But do you have to be conscious of what that imprint was? I mean, like if it happened lives ago.
Do you have to be conscious of it? I mean, we have to at least make some concerted effort to purify against it. We can't be conscious of everything we've done since beginningless time because we don't have that capacity in our minds. I mean, you can develop some clairvoyance, as they say, so you can know your past lives and maybe know something of the actions you've done to create various experiences. But in terms of that vast sea of actions, we have to do the best we can with every day of our lives to try to purify what we're currently planting, imprinting on our minds. And then in general ways, try to recall and try to generate the 4 opponent powers against the actions that we don't remember. We can think in any other time, in any lifetime, when I've engaged in an intentional act of killing, an intentional act of stealing, an intentional act of whatever, all the various 10 non-virtues. And I don't know how, I mean, I've never heard, I don't know that they even know. I mean, how effective is purification when it's done more generically versus more specifically? I don't know. But I think it's important to do it regardless of how effective it might be, because I'm sure it has some impact. Whether it, again, completely blocks it from giving rise to its result, or whether it just causes it to be a lesser result. So we get a headache instead of a rebirth in a hell realm. You know, we can be rejoicing in our headache because it's much easier to deal with a headache in the human realm than it is an entire existence in the hell realm. So the purification is always recommended as a way of at least reducing the effects of these karmic seeds, if not completely removing them. So any other questions on what we talked about? Thanks for that. Any questions from online that have been posted? Yeah, Rowena.
I have confusion around, okay, we're talking, like you said, this is the causal karma that you're talking about, but there's so many different things that feed into it.
Mm-hmm.
And then when you do purification, you can do purification very specifically, like that, whatever that might be, that you're going to have a bad rebirth, but trying to figure out, I'm backtracking actually, what I'm doing when I'm thinking about this, is trying to figure out what types of actions generate the one that's worrying you about, and how you repeat them. I learn a certain amount by observing my repeated behavior,
Right.
and I'm not sure of my accuracy. I mean, I have to look at it and see if, so I'll try and purify that, and then all of a sudden I realize there's a bunch of other stuff. It's like,
Yeah.
it's spawn or something. It's kind of crazy.
I mean, as you're pointing out, I mean, the process is very complex. And in terms of karma, we are talking about a factor that's involved in almost every aspect of our life, because we are conditioned to some degree to continue to do things repetitively, habitually. We have things that we are more familiar with, ways of thinking that do create some synergy, some energy that causes particular seeds to be more powerful, more, those to have more effect. But nonetheless, I mean, yeah, we just have to get a handle on what we can and work with diminishing what things we see as more prominent. And remember, in the Lojong teachings, I can't remember the exact slogan in the 7-point mind training, but it's like, work on the biggest one first. Whatever it is like your worst affliction and your worst behavior, try to curtail that, try to address that, because that's probably indicative of the sorts of things that could be producing some sort of force in a stronger way to propel you into your next existence. To be really attentive to, as you're saying, all the various other conditions and factors that might be feeding into that might be giving rise to that type of behavior or that way of thinking. So I don't know.
To some degree, I try and work with the ones that give me the strongest sense of I first. But then there's some subtle tricksters in there.
Yeah.
You could spend your whole day doing purification, as far as I know.
Sure. I mean, that's why doing like a 3-month Vajrasattva retreat is so powerful, because you're doing that every day, and it gets deeper and deeper as you go more and more into this. Even the practice day that we had, a few of you in the room were here on Saturday for the practice day. Every time you sit down and do purification in a more concerted way, you do go a little bit deeper, hopefully. If it starts to become pretty superficial, then I think we need to examine that and, try to deepen our purification practice. But yeah, there are factors that can affect all of this. Certainly purification in terms of removing the potency of those karmic actions we've imprinted on the consciousness of third link that could give rise to a rebirth. But also you can harm the virtuous ones you've created, the meritorious actions in your second link that you've imprinted on the consciousness. Beware of those, of harming those by way of having a mind of anger. Really strong mind of anger can be a way of diminishing the potency of those. Having wrong views can be another way. Any real strong affliction can sometimes impair those. So we have to really tend to our minds. This is part of our job. Yeah, there is a question from is that okay, Rowena? Yeah, okay, thanks.
What was the third type of consciousness? Causal, affect?
Oh, there's not a third type of consciousness, I don't think. You have the causal consciousness, and then you have the resultant or effect consciousness. They're both the same, resultant and effect. So again, the very first one, the causal consciousness, is specifically the moment when that action has been completed in the consciousness of the mind of the person who's done that action. It resides again with the subtle consciousness all the way until it is the first moment of the effect of the next existence, which is the effect consciousness or the resultant consciousness. That's the third link. It's usually just called consciousness, but we divide it into 2 parts because at the very end of this discussion of the 12 links, we'll go into how they play out in terms of either 2 lifetimes or 3 lifetimes, because it's not like this is all one lifetime, these 12 links. We are doing the first 2.5 links, 1, 2, and the first part of 3, throughout every existence. We're planting those that are ending up on our consciousness whenever we've had a volitional act we've engaged in through our ignorance that is set to give rise to another rebirth, which again would be an act that is complete in terms of the various factors that we discuss in the karma classes on virtue and non-virtue. If it has been imprinted on our minds, it continues to be with our minds until it's either purified or negated in some way, offset, or it gives rise to its effect. So that obviously means it's got to be playing out over at least more than one lifetime. We can plant some seeds in this life that ripen in terms of our next rebirth. And that way it would be playing out in 2 lifetimes. But a lot of what we plant isn't going to give rise until many lifetimes from now. As I said, you only get one of these at the end of each life that gives rise to your next existence. So you're not depleting all these actions very quickly. That's why purification is so important too, is because you have scores of these non-virtuous, non-meritorious actions we've engaged in that have to be addressed, that have to be dealt with. Yes, Mark.
Wouldn't it make more sense to just completely focus all your energy on the paramitas and on wisdom?
Well, yeah. So the question is, for those online, wouldn't it make more sense to focus all one's energy onto the 6 paramitas and these other virtuous actions and not be as, I think it's a matter of doing both. Often they talk about the path, even Tsongkhapa, when he had a vision of Manjushri told him to gain realizations, he had to accumulate great merit through what we do by engaging in what you're talking about, Mark, the generosity and patience and morality and all this. And then also we have to, purify. We have to get rid of all the negative things that are acting as obstacles, because we're talking here about just the karmas that give rise to rebirth, that particular result, but we create karmas to create a variety of other results. And many of those can become obstacles for us in terms of the health in this life or the experiences in this life and various other factors, behavior in this life. So we see that purification is an important part of the process too. The third thing that Manjushri told them, at least this is how Lama Zopa presents it, is that we have to make single-pointed requests to our gurus, which is of course in line with this teaching that I've been going through a little bit on Sunday, dedicating oneself to the guru, following the advice of the guru. But essentially the first two are, so it's not just accumulate merit, do lots of virtuous, positive things, and you'll be fine. We also do have to purify. We do have to be intent upon pulling the weeds out of the garden, in addition to planting the seeds that will give rise to beautiful flowers. So does that help a little bit? Yeah, Mark. I'm Bob.
Yeah, I mean, there is the example of Tsongkhapa,
Yeah.
who, in order to gain a direct realization of emptiness, he had to do millions of purifications,
Yeah.
as well as millions of merit.
Yeah.
But he just couldn't do millions of merit because he had the obstacles.
Yeah.
So he had to do both. He had to remove the obstacles, getting a direct realization,
Right.
as well as acquiring the necessary merits.
Yeah.
So you really can't just accumulate merit based on
Yeah.
this example.
I mean, yeah. So Bob was just pointing out, that even in Tsongkhapa's life story, I mean, he had to not just do all the 100 million mandala offerings on the rock, but also to accumulate merit, but he also had to do all the prostrations and the Vajrasattva recitations and all the things that are about purification. And again, you're working, they're working in tandem. They're both positive energy that you're moving forward. But nonetheless, we do have, as you're pointing out, Bob, obstacles. We do have these things that can ripen in our lives that can become major things to deal with. And that could, even end this life prematurely, for example. So anyway,